All right, so I guess what I was going to do is just try and give a little bit of a, I don't know, state of the lab, status update thing, what's going on. And I'll try and keep it short just so that there's time for questions, and we'll see how that goes. So, first off, thanks for having me. It's good to meet with you virtually and tell you a little bit about all that's happening at the lab. It is a kind of pretty busy time right now for the last several years, really, but it's been picking up the pace. And of course, in the end, that's driven by the world around us. Unfortunately, we're at a point in history where the missions of the lab have kind of reasserted themselves on the global stage, really. And, the main, of course, mission of the lab is national security, bringing the best science to national security. And that's something we've done since 1943. And within that, deterrence and the nuclear deterrent is the largest component. And that deterrent that we are responsible for a significant portion of has largely been fairly static since the 80s, since the end of the Cold War. We've had a posture of kind of taking care of it, but not really doing much to it. And of course, there was for quite some time after the end of the Cold War and the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, I think there were hopes that over time, nuclear deterrence would become less important in global affairs. The US didn't want to be in a position of doing anything provocative. So I said the posture was to kind of take care of things, and that was called stockpile stewardship. We've been doing that since the end of the 80s. Things began to change geopolitically probably, around the mid 2000s. And it happened sort of slowly, and I don't think it was totally obvious really what was happening. Although now with the benefit of hindsight, you can go back and listen to the speech that Putin gave to the Munich Security Conference in 2007 and recognize that he was telling us what he was going to do. Of course, with the ascension to power of Xi Jinping in 2012, China underwent a fairly dramatic shift from their policy, which had been characterized as peaceful rise, to one that was, more confrontational to their neighbors. So as a result, we kind of slowly shifted gears from a posture where we were hoping that, what was called great power competition was on the decline. And, of course, with 9/11, we shifted focus from a national security point of view to the global war on terror. And, thoughts of nuclear deterrence and armed conflict in Europe were a long way away from our minds, I think. And of course, in the last couple of years, that's really changed. And it's changed at the same time that we reached the end of the road on watching the 1980s era deterrent gracefully age and have begun to more aggressively modernize it because it's quite frankly wearing out. And so that's one of the reasons why the lab is right now very busy. There are others. There's been lots of investments in clean energy, which is another part of our mission. And of course, we continue to work on nuclear nonproliferation, and we're doing a lot of really amazing fundamental science and exploring Mars. So remarkably, actually, all of our missions have been enjoying strong support and bipartisan support. So as a result, we've been growing. Right now, our total workforce, which includes not just the roughly 12,000 regular kind of full-time employees, but also some of our subcontractors like the security force, the students. We have about 1,800 students who come in the summer as interns, other people who work at the lab every day. Now numbers about 15,000. That's the largest it's ever been. And of those, about 40% live in Los Alamos County and Los Alamos and White Rock. The other 60% come from throughout northern New Mexico, about 20% from Rio Arriba County, 20% from Santa Fe County, there's about 10% of lab staff who drive all the way up from Bernalillo County, which is a pretty long haul. So we've been working to kind of support that growth. In fact, we've not that long ago, we opened 2 new offices in Santa Fe, returning to Santa Fe. We started in Santa Fe with, of course, the office that's now memorialized with the historic park, a plaque at 109 East Palace. But when Dorothy McKibben retired in 1963, that office was closed down. So we've returned to Santa Fe with some additional office space to help us support that growth, because really we just did not have room for people in the laboratory, and Los Alamos itself is pretty space challenged as well. Also helps a bit with the recruiting. So the budget this year is, well, actually for the current fiscal year for FY23, which started in October, we're anticipating, of course, we don't have a budget yet. There's a continuing resolution. We never get a budget on October the 1st, but if we did, we would have expected to have about $4.4 billion this year, which is also at an all-time high. Last year, we spent about $1.3 billion in salaries. And that highest ever workforce number is reflective of the hiring we've been doing. In the last fiscal year that ended at the end of September, we hired 2,077 new employees, which is the largest hiring we can sort of find over the time period that our records are sort of good for. You know, the systems we have now probably are only good back to 30 years ago or something. Actually, about 60% of the FY22 hires came from New Mexico. So we're working very hard with great partnership, actually, with a lot of the educational institutions in the state to try and make sure that people who are graduating, young people who are graduating in the state have the skill sets that we need so that they can, you know, move into our workforce, because we do, you know, pay well. We have good benefits. In fact, recently we've taken some steps to improve our benefits. They were not competitive in all areas in terms of things like disability leave and maternity leave, and we added compassionate care for family members. So we're trying to become a more attractive employer. And part of the reason for that actually is, although we exceeded our goal for hiring with 2,077 new employees, the thing we did not anticipate was our attrition rate went up. So for the last several years, we've been hiring about 11 or 1,200 employees and losing about 500 or 600. So net growth about 500 or 600. And last year, because the budgets went up, we hired more. We got the 2077, so we exceeded the 2,000 goal, but we lost 1,100. So our attrition rate basically doubled over the course of 1 year. That's not unique to the lab. I mean, you probably read about the Great Resignation, and lots of employers are seeing higher attrition rates, but we're trying to respond. And that's one reason that we took some steps to improve our benefits. And we actually made some mid-year salary adjustments and so forth, because when we hire people, we actually invest a lot in them to get them trained up and security clearance and all that kind of stuff. So it's very painful when they leave, and we'd rather hang on to them for, the length of a productive career. So we now have 8 formal partnerships in place with some of the regional colleges and high schools that are part of that pipeline that's allowed us to increase our hiring from within the state. There are other challenges that come with that hiring, and I'll talk maybe a little bit about some of those in a bit. But I know there are other things that I need to get to. I think one thing you were interested in hearing about is the new responsibility the lab has for pit production, which is one of the reasons we've been growing, although it's not the only reason. As I said, really across the board, our science programs, our energy programs, our non-proliferation programs, other areas of national security have all been growing. But the largest single area driving the increased budget is the funding needed to reconstitute the nation's capability to make what are called pits, which are the first part of the first stage, so-called primary, of the nuclear weapons that are in our deterrent. And as I mentioned, for many years with stockpile stewardship, we had a posture of, taking care of the systems that were built in the 80s. And over time, there were various components in the systems that would age out that we had to replace. But the most robust, reliable, long-lived component has been these pits. So we've been able to extend them well beyond their original design lifetime, but they are also getting older. And as we're starting to deploy refreshed systems that are going to be out there for decades, we needed to begin once again manufacturing pits, which had not been done since the closure of the Rocky Flats plant in Colorado, essentially at the end of the Cold War. So all the weapons we have now, and in fact, the ones that we're currently refurbishing have pits that were made in the 1980s. And every year they all get a year older. And we need to be confident that they work, because in the end, the essence of deterrence is it has to be credible. You certainly hope never to have to invoke it, but in order for it to restrain the action of others, it has to be a credible risk for them to take into account. And actually, I would say if you look at what's happening in the Ukraine right now, you see a worked example of that, where the role that deterrence is playing is actually, it's twofold. We are being deterred by the Russian threats, in the sense that the president has been very clear that there will be no direct military engagement by the US or by NATO. So we are responding by applying sanctions and arming the Ukrainians, but the US is not intervening militarily. And one reason is because we do not wish to be in a direct military conflict with a nuclear armed adversary. So that's an example of deterrence. The flip side of it is when the president says not 1 inch of NATO territory, there's something behind that, which is that the Russians know that if they directly engage with NATO, that's a risk that they would be assuming. And so far, despite statements like the supply chain for weapons into Ukraine is a legitimate military target, the Russians have not engaged in Poland or in other countries that are the conduit for arms to the Ukraine. They have been restrained. So the role of deterrence in that conflict is to basically, so far, and of course it's scary and we don't know how it's going to end, but so far it's to contain the conflict and keep it from spreading, to the rest of Europe and to NATO. And of course, we know from 1939, when the Nazi Germany and 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland, what can happen when a conflict spreads in Europe. And of course, the same thing happened when Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, and that led to World War I. So, deterrence is a factor in what's going on in global affairs. And in order for it to be a factor, it has to be effective. And that's why we're now taking on this challenge of, as I said, reconstituting a portion of the pit manufacturing capability. It'll be a smaller portion of it. The plan is to stand up a larger capability in South Carolina, in Savannah River, that's tasked with producing pits. But right now, our PF4 facility, which was initially built as a kind of R&D prototyping facility at the end of the 70s and came into operation in the early 80s, is the only place in the country where we can do this work. Now, it requires, it's a heavy lift to repurpose it from a 80s era R&D and prototyping facility into a small scale production facility. We're supposed to make 30 pits a year. So I think the way to think about this is like an artisanal blacksmith shop when you're only making 30 of an object. However, in order to do that, we have to pull out a lot of the old equipment, replace it with new state-of-the-art manufacturing equipment, update the buildings. We're making a lot of safety and security improvements to make sure that the facility remains, up to modern standards. And a significant, but not the only part of our growth is the staffing that's associated with that, production staff and support staff to allow them to do their work. And we're going to continue to hire for the next couple of years to support the mission. As I mentioned, a lot of the infrastructure investments, in addition to the equipment that you use for manufacturing the pits, are things like safety improvements, seismic reinforcement of the foundation of the facility. We're in the process of upgrading the fire suppression system and the fire detection system, and making sure that everything is there to support the kind of robust safety environment that we need to do this work, and make sure that we're protecting the environment. It's a recycle operation, as it turns out, because their country no longer manufactures plutonium. We don't need to. We've got a lot in the old pits that we can basically melt down, clean up, and repurpose. So that's a little bit about the pit mission. I did want to say a little bit more about some of the growth impacts, because that is something that certainly touches the broader community. And it's a challenge, with hiring 2,000 people, even though only about 1,000 of them are new employees, about 1,100 of them are replacements. That's people that turns out need a place to work. They need space. That's one reason why we've expanded to Santa Fe. They need a parking place, so we've had to build parking garages. They want a place to live. They need a place to send their kids to school, etc. So housing is a challenge for sure. That's actually a national challenge. The country's not in great shape in terms of housing stock, because after the sort of housing bubble collapsed in 2008, new housing starts plummeted and stayed low for many, many years. So basically, the country as a whole, and it's true in our region too, hasn't built enough houses to support the population that we have. And so that's one reason why we've seen, increases in housing prices and a pretty hot housing market. It's starting to cool off a bit now, I think, because the economy is slowing down a bit. But the underlying shortage is a problem, and it's certainly a shortage where we live, because Los Alamos County is relatively landlocked. It's beautiful having Santa Fe National Forest, Bandelier National Monument, 1,000-foot cliffs overlooking the river, but means there's a lot of non-buildable property, and so most of the options in Los Alamos County are actually reuse options, and actually we're seeing a lot of that, with things like the development that's going in the old federal site where the field office was, for example, although it takes time. So the housing developments that are underway now are the result of conversations that have been going on for 3-4 years. Santa Fe is also seeing more housing development than it has for quite some time, particularly on the south side, multifamily dwelling units, which actually is great for kind of our early career staff who are coming in. It's not something that we can directly address, in the sense that, unlike 1943, we're not going to have the Army Corps of Engineers build a bunch of barracks. And actually, I think if we did, we would find that that wasn't solving our problem, because I don't think people want to live in 1943 Army barracks anymore. But what we have been doing is really trying to engage closely with the developer community and regional leaders to kind of forecast the demand that we anticipate, and the hiring we're doing, and the wages that we pay. And we've been doing that really, as I said, for the last 3 or 4 years. And I think we are seeing the results of that in some of the developments that are coming online. The challenge is really just that it takes time to do those sorts of things. But it's encouraging that there is new supply starting to manifest itself now. So we're going to continue, telling the story about what we project our needs to be. I would say our budgets have been very, very stable and predictable. And unfortunately, I don't see the geopolitical situation miraculously getting better anytime soon. So I think from a business point of view, it's not a terribly high risk to anticipate that Los Alamos is going to be a vibrant institution for the foreseeable future. We're also trying to alleviate some of the pressure by changing our approach to where people work. And this, of course, was something that we learned somewhat unwillingly as a result of the pandemic, that actually there is a lot of what we do that we can do pretty effectively remotely. Not everything. We do classified work, and we don't allow people to take classified material home. Obviously, no one's making pits in their garage. So there's some things that aren't amenable to telework or hybrid work, but lots of what we do actually is. And so we've now got about 3,500 employees who are either full-time telework or kind of hybrid, sort of half-time on-site and half-time working out of their home. That keeps cars off the road. It makes it more practical if you're further away, if you can avoid that long commute. Our offices in Santa Fe are actually configured so they can serve, part of the space can serve as a telework hub, so that if someone is in sort of hybrid status, coming in some of the time, they can use a space there. They're all configured so you can hook your laptop up, and there's kind of storage lockers to keep papers and so forth. And if you need to have face-to-face meetings, you can do that, but then someone else can occupy the space, the next day. And so it means that, one of the office buildings is Pacheco, on Pacheco Street, which is sort of at the corner of St. Michael's and St. Francis near the rail station. And it has about 300 spots for people, but we think with this hybrid telework, we'll actually be able to support about 900 people. And that helps us in terms of traffic congestion and, the housing crunch in Los Alamos County, at least. We're trying also to work on transportation plans to get mass transit that's kind of more user-friendly. Even on site, we're looking at as part of our sustainability goals by 2050, we're aiming to be net zero, looking at how we can develop, electric or hydrogen powered buses and heavy equipment for moving people and stuff around the site with, less of a carbon footprint and so forth. That's the sort of thing that'll be fleshed out as part of the site-wide environmental impact statement that NNSA has embarked on. Is, it looks at the environmental footprint of all of the laboratory operations, and even those sort of secondary footprints like the commuting that's associated with coming to work and our vehicle fleet and so forth. Another important area that we're starting to think about is childcare. The one consequence of the hiring is it's changed our demographics quite a bit. And now we have 6,000 employees under the age of 45, which is double what it was in 2015. That's tremendously exciting, actually, to have a lot of younger people, recent college graduates joining the lab. And of course, many of them are at a stage in their life where childcare is one of their top concerns. And we actually recently did a survey of our employees to sort of understand this, because we were hearing, particularly after COVID, where a lot of the childcare facilities were closed, of course, and there was a hit to the capacity of the system, basically. And so we did a survey and learned, to try and put some numbers around it. And our employees right now are caring for about 3,500 children under the age of 13 and about 1,300 children under the age of 5, which is sort of the area where childcare is the most critical problem, since they're not yet in school. And what we found when we surveyed our staff, only 22% of our staff have the childcare that they need. There's not enough slots, and in addition, with this plutonium manufacturing pit mission that we have, that's a 24/7 operation, and it's extremely difficult to find childcare if you're working, off the normal kind of 9 to 5-ish work hours, which people on shifts at TA 55 are. So there's a definite gap in terms of childcare needs. The reasons when we do exit interviews for this increased attrition of our early career staff is about 60% of the increase, 68% of the increased attrition was staff with 0 to 5 years experience. Childcare is one of the cited reasons for why people are feeling like they need to look for work elsewhere. So based on that, we're trying to think what can we do to help address this need? Now, I will say right up front, Los Alamos National Laboratory is not a childcare provider. We will never be a childcare provider. Even access to the lab for people under the age of 18 is not straightforward. So we're not looking to set up a childcare facility, and we're not looking to compete with the people who do that, because quite frankly, we're not good at it. We would be terrible at it, I'm pretty sure. What we are interested in doing is finding ways to help increase the capacity. And so you may have seen, we recently issued a request for expressions of interest to see if there are any childcare providers who have ideas for how they could expand their capacity, potentially with a little bit of help, because the lab is managed by a company through a contract. That's the way it's been since the beginning. And the contract is held by this thing called Triad National Security LLC. And one of the partners of Triad is the University of California, which actually had the contract to manage the lab going all the way back to 1943. And they've made a commitment to help out in this regard financially. So we're hoping that we get some interest expressed as a part of this request for expressions of interest for some good ideas of how to expand the capacity for childcare. Understanding that we're not going to be in that business, but we are very much interested in having more, more slots basically for laboratory employees to have their children taken care of in a high quality environment at market competitive rates. So it's open to any childcare provider. I know there's been a little bit of concern expressed that somehow we're going to try and drive people out of business. I can assure you that is not the objective of this. We need more childcare slots, not fewer. And so, if somehow we were to do something that caused someone to go out of business, we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. So it's really about growing the capacity to meet this very substantial need that was identified in the survey of our staff. We have, in the survey, I think 200 employees said they are looking for childcare right now. That's an indicator, I think, of the fact that we just need more capacity. That's the real challenge. So that's probably about enough. I think I've talked for a long time, and it would be great if there are some questions. I'd love to try and answer them.
I will say that I don't see any in the chat. So what you can do is either, I think I can see these. It's 2 pages here on my computer. So if someone have a question you want to start off with, Maura?
Yes, I do, Caroline. Good evening, Tom. We spend another evening together. I guess we were both at the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board meeting.
This is pretty much fun, the Defense Board.
All day yesterday, and it was like having a crash course in pit production. I hung in there as best as I could. It was very impressive. I noticed that the Santa Fe New Mexican said that NNSA and you were grilled by the board, and I didn't feel that to the extent that they did, and I'll be putting up a story about it also. But I thought it would be cool to tell the league members about that experience yesterday. It's the 3rd time in the 8 years that I've been writing that I've been to one, and it's very informative. But I thought it would be interesting for people to hear what the board was interested in hearing about from you and from Ted Wyka.
Yeah, sure. And also Jill Ruby, the NNSA administrator, and Jim McConnell, who's the deputy administrator. Right. For people who don't know, the the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, DNFSB, or Defense Board for short, is an independent body that is charged with providing, I guess, safety advice to the Secretary of Energy for the defense nuclear facilities, which would obviously include pretty much everything that we do at Los Alamos. And they're not a regulator. We're actually regulated by DOE. It's self-regulating. And the reason the Defense Board exists is actually because DOE is self-regulating. So there was a feeling that, well, if DOE is going to self-regulate, there better be somebody, keeping an eye on things. And so that's why the Defense Board was set up. And it's got, the members of the board are nominated and confirmed by the Senate, and there's rules about the partisan mix. So right now it's chaired by Joyce Connery, who was a nominee, a Democratic nominee, because it's a Democratic administration. That sort of alternates as the administration changes. And then there's staff, professional staff who do a lot of the analysis work and so forth. And the purpose of the hearing was actually to really focus. There were two purposes. They heard from the environmental management part of DOE and N3B, that's the contractor that manages the environmental management. And that's the activity associated with the cleanup of legacy waste. So leftovers from the Cold War and the Second World War. And so that was the first part of their hearing, was the legacy waste, which also falls under the Defense Board. And then the second part, or actually the second 2/3, was discussion focused on the PF4 facility and the safety upgrades that are being made and what the progress is and that sort of thing. They have a particular interest in the in an active confinement ventilation system and its qualifications against earthquake and fire accident scenarios and so forth. So we spent a lot of time talking about that, which is actually the reason for the new fire suppression system that I mentioned that we're installing, is to help further reduce that risk. It's an interesting process. It's a little bit like a congressional hearing in terms of how it functions. And then they have inspectors on site who are actually in the facilities who keep an eye on things day to day. They publish a weekly report, which I think Moira is quite familiar with, because pretty much any story in the New Mexican about Los Alamos is probably stimulated by one of the weekly reports that the Defense Board writes, where they said, oh, something happened. And then, that will result in a news story. So it's good to keep them informed and make sure they understand what we're doing. And that was the purpose of the hearing. Let's see, there's some questions now. So I'll just start reading through these, and then if someone wants to, add in verbally, feel free to do that. So the first one I see is from Stephanie. What percentage of the potential hires turn down a job due to lack of housing? We don't have great data on that. We do exit interviews from people who leave, which is where we know it's definitely one of the issues. The number one issue is salary. And that's actually true, I think, in exit interviews everywhere. People, particularly in a higher inflation environment, people are looking for opportunities to kind of compensate for that. And one way to solve that problem is to find another job somewhere else that pays more. But housing is listed in the exit interviews as one of it's probably kind of the number two factor. In terms of our challenge is really not so much hiring, I would say, though. We hired 2,077 people with great credentials and lots of enthusiasm and exceeded our target for hiring. So our challenge is more on the retention. So I think it may be that people don't understand how tough it is to find housing till they get here. And then, if you wind up in Rio Rancho, that may seem okay for a while, but I think probably after 3-4 years, that starts to be kind of a long commute. So I think that's more the dynamic around housing is people come here and then they have a hard time finding something that fits their needs within a reasonable distance. We've had a few people, I think, express concerns about their ability to find a place, but as I said, our challenge is not so much getting people, it's this increase in attrition in the early career staff after they're here. The government is still trying to meet its promise to store spent nuclear fuel. What's your opinion of the Holtec proposal in southern New Mexico? I mean, to some extent, we don't really have a dog in that fight. The thing that's really important to the lab is the WIPP facility in southern New Mexico, which is explicitly for transuranic defense waste, which basically means stuff out of PF4 and like facilities. Certainly WIPP is a great solution for that. It's impressive facility, actually. When I visited a couple of years ago, the main elevator shaft was down, so I got to ride down. They have a secondary elevator shaft that was used when they first installed the facility. It's a wild ride. It's like one of those things at Disney. You go down 2,000 feet pretty darn fast, and then you're in this salt seam it's designed so that basically you excavate it and then it collapses and compresses and contains the waste. And of course, the fact that there's salt there tells you there's not a lot of movement of water through there that can cause the waste streams to propagate. And that goes back to the Permian. It's good in terms of long-term stability and encapsulation. So it's a great solution for the waste that we're shipping from Los Alamos, either because we're making pits or because it's legacy waste that the EM program is going to take care of. There is a proposal to establish in the same region. There's actually one in southern New Mexico. There's another proposal that's really just across the border in Texas, and geologically it's an equivalent proposal to the one in southern New Mexico, to establish interim storage sites because of the fact that government is still trying to find a permanent storage solution. The concern that's been expressed both by the state of New Mexico and by Texas actually is people are skeptical about the interim. Because there's no identified permanent storage solution, they're concerned that what may seem perfectly reasonable as an interim solution could de facto become a permanent solution. So that's the reason for the political controversy. I mean, I would say, the question of spent nuclear fuel is actually not a scientific and engineering problem. It's a social and political problem. That doesn't mean it's easy to solve, but there are good technical solutions for the long-term disposal of spent nuclear fuel, and it's actually by volume not a very large amount of material. It's a manageable problem technically, but socially and politically, it's a fiendishly complicated problem, and that's the real challenge there. Let's see. How will you handle the increased waste associated with the new pit production project? Well, we've been ramping up the waste shipments. And in fact, every year for the last 3 years, we've shipped more waste than we produced, even though the amount of work we've been doing has been increasing significantly year over year. So we've actually been drawing down the inventory of waste in the PF4 facility, even though we've been ramping up production. So I feel pretty good that we're able to stay ahead of the curve in terms of the newly generated waste that we're producing. The critical thing actually is WIPP itself. And it's going to have to go down for an upgrade to the ventilation system. So that's one reason we've been working so hard to de-inventory, because WIPP will be down for about a year for the new ventilation system. So we needed to have some space so that we could keep running and then resume shipments once WIPP comes back online. And we've increased because we've been shipping more, the amount of time that a newly filled waste drum at PF4 sits around is reduced dramatically. It was 500 days before it got shipped off site. We're down to 200 days. And at the rate we're going, hopefully we'll get it down to, tens of days. So that the goal is that it's just going to be pretty much real time in place it as it's produced. What are the staffing numbers projected to be in 3 to 5 years, including new hires to meet mission requirements and attrition replacements? We're going to try again to hire another 2,000 people this year. I'd really love to lose only 500 or 600 instead of 1,100, because that would be helping us meet our goals in terms of overall growth. We expect that growth rate to continue for another 2 to 3 years, and then it'll level off, and we'll just be doing the hiring to replace the retirements, which is that 500 to 600 that's been our sort of historical attrition rate. Can you say, question from Jennifer, can you say something about student pipeline, particularly in encouraging students to study topics of interest to LANL? How does LANL's outreach to universities work? The lab has a pretty well-established program, or programs really, of engaging students. I mentioned we have about 1,800 or 1,900 interns who come in the summer to work at the lab. Many of them are in the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, math, but in fact, many of them are outside of that in other areas, because we need people with all different sorts of skills. So we have people in, accounting and so forth, and communications. And so that's been important to the lab for quite some time, actually, partly because of our location, because we're in a kind of less populated region of the country. There's not a big base of potential employees. Livermore Lab is in the Bay Area, so there's lots of people around. Argonne is in Chicago. We're a friend of mine once said that Los Alamos is at the end of the world's longest cul-de-sac, right? And it's a very beautiful cul-de-sac, but there's not a lot of people around that we can just draw on organically. So we have to catch people's interest early. And my evidence that it works is if you go into any meeting at the lab in any division, doesn't matter whether it's a science division, an engineering division, an operations division, a business division, and you ask how many people first came to the lab as a student, you'll actually see a substantial number, usually majority of the people in the room put up their hands. So those internship programs are particularly important. What we've been doing recently is trying to work with educational institutions to align degree programs that they have to particular skills needs that we anticipate at the lab. So, for example, there's been a real issue with a chronic shortage of radiation control technicians. And so we worked with Northern New Mexico College to set up an RCT program, and that's actually helped. We've now got a much better supply. A couple of years ago, there were a lot of concerns about finding crit safety engineers, which is, again, very specialized skill, not something most people even know exists. And so we worked with Texas A&M to add that to their nuclear engineering program, and that's helped develop a pipeline of crit safety engineers. So we're trying to get a little bit more targeted in some of those pipeline programs. See, Jody had a question. What responsibility will LANL assume for the impact on infrastructure, housing, schools that will include with the influx of thousands of new hires? Well, we do a couple things. First is we pay taxes, and actually a lot of taxes. The gross receipts tax, which, most of which goes to the state, and a lot of it goes to Los Alamos County, helps pay for a lot of that infrastructure. And we pay our employees well, and they pay taxes, and they also, shop in the communities and buy housing and so forth. So that's the principal way that we do that. As I said, the solution of building barracks is not one that I think is workable for the 21st century. But there are other ways that we contribute to the region that I think do help out. We also, in a sort of more philanthropic mode, try and help out with support that we provide and actually our staff provide through the employee giving program to organizations like the LANL Foundation, which funds, there's a laboratory LANL employee scholarship fund that every year funds scholarships throughout northern New Mexico. And we're also providing funding for economic development, for regional economic development through RDC. So there are other things that we're doing in addition to kind of the straight kind of payroll taxes vectors, if you will. Let's see, Rebecca had a question. I think a large part of national security is getting off oil and gas. What's the lab's role in getting their society zero emissions? Do you think atomic energy should be considered as part of getting to zero emissions? So yeah, I mean, this is another way actually that the lab is even relevant to the Ukraine crisis, because that's a great example of the relevance of oil and gas to national security. If you ask yourself, why did Putin think that he could get away with invading Ukraine? The answer was because he felt like he had a stranglehold over Western Europe with natural gas and oil supplies, and that would fragment the opposition and you know, allow him to do what he needed to do. And so, you know, that's obviously a good indicator that those dependencies that come with those supply chains have consequences. So, you know, the work that we do in a variety of different areas, the lab's sort of main areas of activity in the energy portfolio include hydrogen fuel cells, which is something we have a long history in. We've been doing work on the grid and smart grid and security for the grid, which is important for enabling more intermittent renewable sources of energy. We're interested in nuclear as well. In fact, we've licensed some of our microreactor technology to Westinghouse. They're now marketing it. It's something called eVinci, which was something that we demonstrated in the kilopower demonstration a couple of years ago. You know, I do think that nuclear power should and is being considered as part of getting to zero emissions, because nuclear energy is close to zero emissions. I mean, there's some emissions associated with concrete and construction of nuclear power plants, but it's pretty small. It's a good complement to renewable power because of the fact that you don't have to manage the intermittency. So for baseload generating, which is largely the role that coal has played, and natural gas has to some extent been assuming some of that. So most of the emissions reductions the US has experienced in the last 15 years or so is because we've been swapping coal for natural gas. Natural gas has about 50% of the CO2 footprint of coal, but it's not zero. And so, and although, you know, we're still at a point now where we can take more solar and wind on the grid and, you know, still manage the demand in some areas of the country and some parts of the world which have higher solar and wind penetration, it's starting to be really challenging managing the intermittency. And of course, adding batteries adds cost. And so having some dispatchable power, which nuclear would represent, can really help with that. Will LANS, NNSA, well, LANS won't be doing anything because LANS is gone, but LANL and NNSA will be making an effort to expedite its net zero goals from the year 2050 to 2035 or 2040. So at the moment, we're still actually, I don't think we've actually formally got the direction yet from the new administration in terms of what they want us to do. You know, one advantage of the infrastructure modernization that's going on is it helps because a lot of our older facilities, the ones that need to be replaced, are also energy hogs. So modernizing our facilities is going to help us. The challenge that we have, which some of the other big labs have, is we have these really large scientific facilities, our accelerators and our supercomputers, and they use a lot of power. If you take the example of our supercomputers, we're actually having to upgrade the power feed into the lab to support not the new supercomputing supercomputer we're getting now, but the next one that comes after Crossroads. Now, we're also anticipating we can improve the energy efficiency of computing by at least another couple of orders of magnitude. So it's not that we're giving up on energy efficiency, but our demands are so high that, you know, the exascale computers that are being deployed now have 1,000 times more computing power than the petascale computers, but they only use twice as much electricity. So on the one hand, that's great improvement in energy efficiency to go up 1,000x, but only double your power, but you still doubled your power demand. So in order for us to get to net zero, it's not going to purely be an energy efficiency exercise. And so we've been doing power purchase agreements. You know, there's a lot of renewables that's going in the state of New Mexico in terms of new solar and new wind. And so we're doing power purchase agreements for that. Another thing we want to do is electrify our vehicle fleet because that will help with tailpipe emissions that, you know, it's kind of hard to collect and sequester. But in terms of the time frame, we're still waiting on the formalization of the direction from NNSA, which is important because in the end they have to foot the bill. Now, I did mention we're doing a new site-wide environmental impact statement, so that's where a lot of this will be laid out in terms of what our plans are. We did look at the options for on-site power generation, and that was done as part of the analysis of whether or not to install a new transmission line. The challenge there is for the scale of power we need, it's much more effective to, you know, get solar power from someplace in the state of New Mexico that's well suited, instead of trying to cover the plateau with solar panels and disrupt all the cultural artifacts. And, you know, if you look at the number of windmills that we've had to put up, it would be extraordinarily disruptive. And it's not the optimal location just because of the geography. So it makes more sense to bring the power in from places that are better suited. So that's why we've been doing power purchase agreements and we're looking at the transmission lines. Sylvie's question on traffic. Are there plans to improve commuting infrastructure, White Rock TA 55 and or public transportation? Plans to increase bike lanes for commuters? I think yes and yes. The near-term thing, which people have probably already seen some of the orange cones going up, is to improve the intersection of Jemez and State Road 4, which gets pretty backed up at shift change. You know, coming out of PF4, the traffic is backed up all the way from that traffic light to White Rock. So the state, and that's not our traffic light, that's a state of New Mexico traffic light. So NNSA worked with the state to help provide some funding actually to accelerate that because it's getting pretty backed up. And that work has now begun. The only sort of bad news about that is, although when it's done, it'll double the throughput of the traffic light, there's going to be a period this spring when it'll probably reduce the throughput of the traffic light because of the construction. That'll be, I think in March is what they're projecting at the moment. So the construction work they're doing at the moment is kind of non-interfering, but at some point in time, it'll get a little bit more constricted and then it'll get quite a bit better. I mentioned that we are trying to look at options for public transportation and park and rides. And there we're trying to work hard with the site office to find out what the art of the possible is, or the art of the legal, in terms of ways to support park and rides, so that we just have fewer cars that are trying to get through that bottleneck. And we've already been increasing some of the bike lanes on site, and we're going to be widening Diamond Drive. That'll help as well, and actually putting a roundabout where Diamond Drive meets Pajarito. So there's stuff on site which is laboratory property where we can make the investments. We don't have to convince the state to do it. I think the bigger challenge is that once you get offsite, then we've got to be working with, you know, local regional governments. You know, Los Alamos County's obviously been making a lot of improvements. And of course, just like the traffic light, those get worse before they get better, but, you know, eventually it gets better. So the surrounding communities in the state have to be factored in. Edward asked if the survey showed us concerns about medical availability, especially OB/GYN. The survey did not, because it was only focused on childcare, but I do understand that that is a concern, had been a concern, sort of got fixed, then got unfixed. And in fact, I met with the new president of the Los Alamos Medical Center a couple months ago, and she is also very aware and working on that issue. Let's see. Stephanie Knockley. In the last election, we heard a lot about the possibility, hope of massive DOE land transfers. How realistic is that? Well, I don't know what land people were dreaming about. You know, there's really not a lot of options, to be honest. There's Rendia Canyon, which has some challenges. You know, sometime that may be possible, but you know, it's got a lot of lead in it. And I think there's unexploded ordnance. And we've seen some of the surprise birthday presents that can come with land transfers not that long ago. You know, any place you dig in Los Alamos, you're either going to find unexploded ordnance, historical artifacts of, I think in this case, cyclotron produced microgram quantities of plutonium, or you're going to find cultural artifacts or human remains. So, you know, our options for land transfer are actually pretty severely limited, especially when you take into account both the mission needs of the lab and the fact that we do need standoff distance for what we do. You know, in fact, in some cases, I think there are some people who wish we were further away because occasionally the windows rattle. You know, we actually do work with high explosives. So, you know, there's, it would be great if there was some beautiful buildable land for housing that we could just transfer. I would be pushing for that as hard as I could, but I can't identify what that option would be. Let's see. I think that looks like the last question. Laura, I think, gave a more diplomatic version of what I just said on the NNSA land transfer question. Other questions?
Well, it is 7:29 and I promised you 7:30. But if there's a burning question and someone has it, you can actually at this point, maybe I can see if you raise your hand. I'm not sure I can see that, but I think I can. If I close this. Otherwise, we will, do I see anybody? No? Okay, that's good. So we're on the place where I want to be. So let me just say thank you to Thom Mason for going through the grill, right? It wasn't terrible. It wasn't terrible. People were nice.
Way more fun than the defense board.
We could have worked on it a little bit to prepare you, but it's good that we were able to have you. This was a change for us. As you know, we normally have lunch, but this is dinner. So that was great. And I really appreciate you coming and talking with us. Thank you so very much. Yes, and I see a lot of other people saying thank you so much for coming. So we will just end this with a happy note. Everybody's happy. And we thank you again.
Well, thanks for having me.